Okay. It's a little loud.
That's Frank's doing, he the one said that.
Especially for only 3 people. All right. All right. Let's see. Still kind of loud, but I'm also standing right in front of it. Okay, well, let's get started. I'll just talk softly. We are in Exodus chapter 2. Goodness. Exodus chapter 2. And we are going to see today how God calls Moses to be this leader of Israel. Last time that we met, which would have been 2 weeks ago, we began the book of Exodus, and we talked about how Israel goes on for a number of years with really no information told about them. But we see God was still with them. We saw that evidence in their prosperity. We saw that evidence in the fact that there was faith in Israel. We saw that in the midwives. And then we just got into the Moses story, and that's where we pick things up today. So let's go to Exodus chapter 2. We'll start at verse 11. Let's begin with a prayer, and then I think I'm going to mess with this volume knob one more time, and then we'll come back and read this. But let's pray. Dear Lord God, we thank you for your mercies. We thank you last week for celebrating the freedoms that we enjoy in this country, a big one, which is the freedom to worship you openly and freely and to speak about you in a very free way that allows us to spread the light of your gospel without much persecution, and that is truly a blessing from you, and we should not overlook that. We ask that as we study today, you would help us to see how your hand is always at work to accomplish its purposes, and how when we, your servants, are weak, you are strong, and you lift us up and direct us. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. Better? It's really loud. It's a little better. Okay. Exodus 2, verse 11. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." "And where is he?" he asked his daughters. "Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his Moses agreed to stay with the man, who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, I have become an alien in a foreign land. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. We'll stop there for now. So that account covers a lot of time, and even the beginning of that count jumps in time a lot from what we read in the first half of chapter 2. First half of chapter 2, we got baby Moses being brought into Pharaoh's household. This part, starting at verse 11, now Moses is an adult, a young man, but nonetheless an adult. And then even as you get into the account, there's this instance killing the Egyptian. There's this instance of trying to be a mediator between some other Hebrews. He goes off into the wilderness, and we can understand that a significant amount of time has passed. Generally, it's estimated like Moses is 40-something when he goes to the burning bush. So you could think maybe he's in his 20s here, late 20s, and then about 20 years later, this has happened. Those are estimates, and I'm also going off the top of my head with that. But, as far as we look at time, a decade, 2 decades is no insignificant amount of time. It might not be the, 40, 80 years that we saw in those Abraham stories at a time. But still, like I said, from our perspective, the way that we look at time, not an insignificant amount of time. But let's examine a little bit of what we're told in this account and why we're told these particular things if we are looking at a serious amount of time. Let's start with this. What did Moses do to try to help his people? And maybe we could even say, what does that tell us about Moses, his thoughts, his attitudes at this point in his life? We can go to a lot of different directions, but let's start with that. What did he try to do? What do you see behind those actions? Yeah, protecting his people. So what was his view of himself? He was raised in the household of Pharaoh, and yet, what do we see? Yeah. He's still very much aware of the fact that he is by blood a Hebrew. He's got a different role for himself than just being, what do the kids who grew up in Pharaoh's household go on to do? Probably be government officials or, have really good business jobs. Same kind of thing as today. The children of the elites go on to be, running businesses or maybe taking up the same kind of political offices as their fathers, that sort of thing. But here's Moses. We're not sure what he was doing, but he's got a great concern for his people instead of just kind of going his own way. So it ends up this time he cares about his people, and he even goes to killing this Egyptian, and then he goes and he's trying to help these 2 Hebrews out, and what kind of reaction does he get there? Yeah. Right. So who dad made you king, right, of the Hebrews? You might be somebody who grew up in the fancy house, and you might be, killing Egyptians thinking you're helping us, but no one made you ruler over us Hebrews. And so what we see very early on in Moses' life is maybe a desire for leadership, maybe a caring concern and an awareness of his position and trying to help, and yet taking it upon himself, he really has no authority and he really accomplishes nothing. Karen? There would have been, and there are. I mean, even today, among peoples that are, you might say, neighbors geographically, you can always tell something. It is interesting to that point that the Hebrews know he's Hebrew here, and yet when he goes out to Midian, Yeah, they call him an Egyptian. So you have to wonder, could that have been something with the way he was dressed that, a Hebrew recognizes a Hebrew, but he's kind of going about dressed like an Egyptian, and then he comes out there and country of origin, he comes from Egypt. I think, again, just think of examples today. Again, some people of certain ethnicities are very recognizable by physical traits, and other people, you might mix them up with someone else. You might mix up a Korean and a Japanese person if you're not real well versed in the different ethnicities there, and yet, there are very big differences there. So here he comes out of Egypt. These Midianite people are like, well, clearly this guy came from Egypt, and there's something about him that's Egyptian, but he's Hebrew. But yes, I think it's fair to say that he would have been recognizable as a Hebrew.
Did Moses, I guess Moses grew a little separate from Pharaoh then? Like a child, or stayed in one corner of the house?
Yeah, I'm no expert at all on those kind of.
If he was a father figure, and the thing was that Moses to the side and said, hey, why don't you do this?
Yeah, and I don't think we have any reason to think of Pharaoh necessarily being this particular father figure kind of thing. It was his daughter that brought this baby and then had him raised in the household, and in a household like that would have meant a lot of servants, doing things. And we remember his mother was the nurse for him because his sister had seen that, and so I don't think we ought to think of it as being kind of this fairy tale thing where the king is nurturing little Moses, and now he becomes the rebellious one and leaves. It's more like he got to grow up in a nice house with the nice things, and certainly was instructed in Egyptian ways and had every advantage, but not that he was, anything like that direction. Good question. So, in many ways, this story is our transition point, and it's a setup point of here's the before God calls Moses things, and then obviously the after God calls Moses things. So the before Moses, here's the situation with Israel, here's kind of who Moses is and how Moses is just on his own, and he's going to have some growth and some instruction from God and and eventually a call from God. We'll see that that's very important here. So like I said, it's kind of a setup, a transition point. One last thing to talk about the transition thing, and then we'll actually go back to question 2. But number 3, why are we told that the king of Egypt dies when the next king is going to be just as, if not more stubborn? So the end of this chapter, we're told that during that long period that Moses is out there living in kind of the wilderness as a nomad, the king of Egypt died. Why would we be told that? Exactly. That comes, and then now God's going to find fit. It's during the next reign that he's going to send Moses, and he's going to take his people out. And so as stubborn as this king was, the one who did not know Joseph and was imposing all these rules, I think we could say the next one is even more stubborn. And we had mentioned that last time. We see Pharaoh. Who's he picking on? He's picking on the babies. He's trying to oppress God's people, but he's not being super effective. And now this next Pharaoh going to be even more stubborn, even more unjust.
Is this the one like Moses' brother?
I don't know who this king would be by name, and again by relation. I'd say, don't think of this as being one little family thing.
I remember some were saying that it was brother versus brother.
Yeah.
The Ten Commandments or not.
Yeah, I would have to look into that to have any guess at that. No doubt, they would be contemporaries in terms of being from the same generation, and what kind of contact they would have together. I don't think anyone could say for certain, because again, this was still a Hebrew baby boy, and an adopted son, and especially in ancient times, there's usually a distinction between an adopted son and a natural born one. Of course, in the Roman world, adopted sons had great standing, and that's why the New Testament tends to use those terms. But we're talking Egypt, we're talking a different time and everything. And I would certainly not put a whole lot of stock in the brother versus brother thing, because, like you're saying, that narrative tends to come from the more secular sources, or more so the secular tellings of the story. And it's not about Moses versus Pharaoh, is it? It's about God versus Pharaoh the whole time. And so that's probably why the scriptures don't give us too much insight into that and don't care about it. Cares a lot more with Moses' attitude toward God and then his conduct, and then God's attitude toward his people, and thus how he acts, and then God's attitude toward someone like Pharaoh who hardens his heart. Those are the big themes. Who the people are, obviously God's guiding them, and their life experiences matter. All right, let's one more thing. I think it's a valid question. What lessons can we learn about trying to help God from what Moses did? And I ask that with this intent that, right, Moses sees his people are in trouble. He cares about his people. He's going to murder an Egyptian. He's going to try to be a mediator and a judge between them. You could say he's trying to do God's work for them, and yet he never was really called or appointed to that kind of work. What kind of lesson can we learn about trying to help God from what Moses did? Yeah, there was a comparison in the People's Bible from Exodus, which is a nice, approachable way to study the book of Exodus from those People's Bible series. I think a lot of people are familiar with those, but there was a comment there of, doesn't Moses kind of remind you of Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane? He draws his sword real quick, and he's going to defend God and God's people there with a quick, irrational decision to go to violence. Yeah, murder is probably not the best way to go about doing God's work, and it's certainly not necessary to defend God, because we'll see God sends all those plagues and then he wipes out Pharaoh's army. If God needed that kind of action, he could take care of it himself, or in the case of Israel conquering Canaan, he can order it. And even there, think of the city of Jericho. What did God remind them? Like, even though I'm going to send you to war, your successes are not going to come from your brute strength or your numbers. They're going to come from the Lord. So yeah, that's one good thing to say in response to trying to help God. Any other thoughts on what we might say there? And maybe I said it already, but there is some significance to having a calling from God. I think we see that very clearly when it comes to ministers and teachers of the gospel, but sometimes too it's wise not to insert ourselves into situations where maybe there isn't not necessarily a direct calling from God the same way that we can say there is in the church for ministers, but consider whether or not it's wise to insert or assert yourself in a place where maybe you haven't been placed into authority, especially when we're talking about authority positions. Which again is not to say that we can't act as servants of God in any and every situation, but again, what kind of is our focus? Are we going with the Peter quick reaction force kind of thing, or are we being gospel forward? Because when we're gospel forward and love, think of what Paul says, love is above all things, and there's never a place where you can't speak the gospel. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you could say in that example, there's maybe two two roles even that I think of that come to mind. One of being, a distributor of God's blessings that you haven't been called to do, and then two, even just being kind of a spiritual guidance when maybe, again, they're kind of showing a lack of understanding there. And that's extremely detrimental to someone's faith to teach false doctrine is what it amounts to. Yeah, thanks for that example. Let's keep moving. Because this next chapter is really the significant part in this preliminary story to God delivering his people. It's Moses and the burning bush. So let's read chapter 3. We'll talk about chapter 4 too, We'll go a little bit more quickly through that in discussion, but we will include that right now. And actually, let's go ahead and read 3 and 4 right away. So I'll read, you can follow along, and I'll stop us where we need to stop. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that the bush, though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. Go, assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt. And I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go, unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that he will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed toward this people, so that when you leave you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians. Moses answered, What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, The Lord did not appear to you? Then the Lord said to him, What is that in your hand? A staff, he replied. The Lord said, Throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, Reach out your hand and take it by the tail. So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake and turned it back into a staff in his hand. This, said the Lord, is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Then the Lord said, Put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was leprous, like snow. Now put it back into your cloak, he said. Now Moses put his hand back into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored, like the rest of his flesh. Then the Lord said, If they do not believe you or pay attention to the first miraculous sign, they may believe the second. But if they do not believe these 2 signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground." Moses said to the Lord, "O Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." The Lord said to him, "Who gave man his mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." But Moses said, "O Lord, please send someone else to do it." Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, "What about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and his heart will be glad when he sees you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and you were God to him. But take this staff in your hand so you can perform miraculous signs with it." We'll stop there. So quite a series of events that take place there on Horeb, the mountain of God, which is the same place as Sinai. We see a lot of things happen there at Horeb at Sinai. Burning bush, giving you the Ten Commandments. Much later on, Elijah comes there. So a lot of connections there on that mountain. But let's start at the beginning. A few things we'll just mention briefly because, again, as we take this study, we're really just trying to trace out how does God, in his activity, create, foster, care for this people in order to fulfill his promise for salvation. But there's a lot of details that when we have the opportunity to read this, we want to at least give mention to them. So we notice Moses and his father-in-law here goes by a different name. One's probably a name, one's probably a title. That's often how it is. In verse 2, we're told, "The angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in this burning bush." Who do we typically identify as the angel of the Lord? Yeah, and probably a little bit more precisely, the second person of the Trinity, just because he's not given the name Jesus yet at this point. But yeah, the Son, the second person of the Trinity, here, the pre-incarnate Christ, Jesus. And we see that name associated with these times when God appears to people in a physical, personal, although maybe you debate calling this a personal appearance, but I would say it is, appearance to people here on earth. And there is some mystery to it, right? It's the pre-incarnate Christ. When God comes to us, condescends, comes down to us, taking on flesh as a man. Well, even though there's still mystery to that, the two natures of Christ, there is an understandability to it. Here is this man, flesh, just as we are, revealing God to us. And yet in the Old Testament, when God appears to people, it's a lot more complex to understand what's going on. And yet it is very personal. Here he is, there, you can say, in the bush. He is speaking. He's having this conversation. And just like when the angel of the Lord comes to Abraham or talks to Hagar, right? These kind of personal conversational ways. It's not just the word of the Lord came, or in a vision, or in a dream, or having a conversation with God. So it's always notable that way. God's coming down. Obviously, the bush not burning up. That's the thing that draws Moses over, and God says, this is holy ground, right? Moses realizes who he's in the presence of. It's the holy God, even coming to him in this form to reveal himself. It's nonetheless the holy God. The big thing that we want to talk about, of course, is going to be the name. Let's talk about that first of all. What does the name I Am tell us about the one true and only God? Sure. No questions asked. I am. How do you argue with that? I am. What else? What other thoughts? There's a lot that it tells us about God. That's a very good one. Sure, but say it.
Well, there's no other God. I'm gonna take care of you no matter what. There's nobody that can hurt you as long as you have faith in me.
Yeah. So even him saying "I am" does give evidence to the fact that there is no other God. In other places in the Old Testament, in particular, where God talks about idols, idols have creators. Humans make them out of stones and wood and stuff. Idols, you can kind of trace their origins, right? They come in a time. I am. Who else is like I am? Who else is and just simply is from eternity to eternity? No one is. And so, then there's a great comfort with that he's with them. And he does talk about himself in kind of, we might say, the traditional way, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's used that phrasing before, and now he connects it to this phrase, I am. That God who was then, is now, and is going to continue to be. So all those things that we said, and how do you argue with that? I like how that's where we started with it, right? And so Moses, we will see that that'll be one of the next things we talk about is his hesitancy, right? Young man who wanted to do something for his people, is even going to go as far as kill somebody, try to insert himself. Now, with that failure and maybe with a little bit more humility of just the wisdom of age, he's a little hesitant. And we'll see, in fact, that, he asks God, he's like, who do I tell them? How will they know that this is really something to listen to? And so God tells them, and then Moses asks, well, how can they really be sure? So God gives him the signs, and then he says, well, what about my talking? And it's like, well, God's the one who gives you the ability to talk anyway. And then finally, what does Moses say? He says, send someone else. And there's the real issue, right? It's the first question we'd say, okay, he's got some hesitancy, he understands his weakness. No, what's really the problem? Send someone else. And even there, God is still gracious, isn't he? He says, yeah, he's going to send Aaron as the press secretary to be with you and speak. And I think it's kind of funny, as it goes forward, Aaron obviously has a big role, but Moses kind of grows into his role, doesn't he? Yeah, absolutely. It's very relatable, and I don't think we'll go too much into that as kind of an application, but it is, right? Like, how easy it is to just kind of shrink into the corner in all kinds of situations. Pardon? Yeah, a lot like Jonah, isn't it? Except Jonah ran away eventually. He maybe took it to the next level. But yeah, that's a huge theme in here. So, just Moses as being being the reluctant servant, God's name, and then one other big thing that we should talk about from this section. Question 6: how did God think of the Israelites during this time of their oppression? What was his attitude toward them? Yeah, he loved them. We touched on it when we began the book of Exodus. Enough time passes that no one knows about Joseph anymore as far as the rulers go. The Israelites become oppressed, and yet what do we see? God's still their God. And this, really, even chapter 2 ends that way. God looked on the Israelites, was concerned about them, heard their groaning, and remembered his covenant with them. Not as if he'd forgot, but that he was aware of it. And then here, too, right? They're called his firstborn. He's going to have mercy on them. God is being their God. So what comforts can we take from that? That here's God's people, Israel, and even though they're in oppression, even though it seems like a long time has passed, God still loves them. God's still working for them. What comfort does that give to us? Yeah. And yet he works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And that's really incredible. I was thinking about that yesterday because I feel like you can't help but think of some grand things on a big scale when you're flying, because you go through an airport and there's hundreds of thousands of people going in and out in these places. And then you get in that airplane and now you look over the world that looks so tiny in these massive cities, filled with people going here and there about their business, and that's just one fraction of the people on earth, because it's one city in one country. And you might travel a few hundred miles and there's still so much more globe. And so you're like, and there's a God over all of this, right? And then you think on top of that, not only is there a God who is the mighty and sovereign God who governs all the world, but there's a God, particularly as the New Testament gives us more detail, and as we live in a New Testament era, there is Christ sitting at the right hand of God who is ruling for the good of his church. And who's to say what things here and there and now and then don't happen exactly the way that they do because there were Christians there? And that God was working for their good in some way, whatever the end purpose was, but that it was good for them. Maybe in a temporal sense, certainly in terms of their faith and their eternity. And that God causes the sun to rise and shine on the righteous and the wicked alike, and yet it's those wicked who are benefiting from the fact that God is doing this for his people. And certainly then there's also the fact that he wants all people to come to a knowledge of Christ and be saved, right? Peter says that God's not slow in keeping his promises, as some understand slowness, but he's holding off on judgment so that more people might be gathered in it. So you got all these big concepts that the good that's happening here, it's for his people. Others are benefiting from the fact that God is showering out his blessings on Christians, and yet through it all, he's trying to gather more people into the flock, and he's making sure that that flock ends up with him in heaven. These huge concepts, and that's exactly what you see with Israel. And that's a great way to think of the Old Testament, is Israel is the church. When you talk about the New Testament and the church, that's how God dealt with Israel. They were the special people. They were the chosen ones. They were the believers. And everyone else benefited from having that contact with them because there were the Lord's blessings and there was the gospel message. And so here in Egypt, things looked bad. Things were bad. But God was going to deliver his people, and more so, they were still his people in terms of eternity. So a huge, huge kind of application there for us in these New Testament times as to God's real concern for his people. Any thoughts that you'd like to add to that, or questions about anything relating to that?
I just think it's funny when you tell the story because you get so excited.
Well, I'm glad that it comes through that way. It is really tremendous just to think of those things. And like I said, you get in certain situations in life, and you can't help but think of those things because knowing what you know from the scriptures, and then say, this is the real world, and this is how God really operates. Were there any other questions about things that we read that maybe just curiosities or something that didn't make sense before we move on to the next part? Like I said, I know we're going fast to try to cover a lot of material and keep this big picture in mind, but if there are little things, we'll give our attention to them. Moses would not have been to Canaan before. And I think we could say reasonably most Israelites probably hadn't. We can't discount that one or another, went there for travel or trade or something, or someone went. But by and large, they were in Egypt. And we have no reason to think that Moses would have gone out there. And that, God says that. This is the land of this ite, all these different peoples. That's not to be overlooked. The land that God's giving to them belongs to a number of other peoples. And they finally get there, and Joshua and the spies go in, and there's that report of the spies, right? What are the people? We're scared. These are big, warlike people. And God's been saying a long time, this land belongs to other people, and I'm going to give it to you. Even when Abraham was there, he lived in tents. He had to buy that one little plot of land because it was not their land yet. Karen, you have something?
It seems kind of strange to me with the whole world when we're in another place so many people
Yeah. Yeah, why didn't he take them over to South America where there probably weren't people, not at least not very many people living at this time in the world? Um, I think that's one of those things where you can say, in hindsight, you can figure out some things there of the fact that, well, this is how the world developed from that part of the world, and that it's the crossroads, and you got the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire, and that is what spread culture and ideas to the whole world. Um, were there people living in the far reaches of Europe and probably even on these other continents by the time that, at least by the time that the apostles were going out? Almost certainly. Again, you kind of get into historical debates there, but, you just think of Alexander. He got all the way to India, and there were people there. And certainly there were people in China and Japan and that area, and no doubt over even in the Americas that people had gotten there. And how and when, no one knows precisely, right? That history is lost to the ages, and yet, by and large, here was the center of civilization, and here was the crossroads of the world, and here's how it's going to spread out, and that's the history that we have. And that's why, like it or hate it, that's why the history that is typically taught and passed on is so Roman-centric and European-centric, is because, that's kind of where the history of the gospel goes. And so, yeah, you might say, why this land that had people already? But in hindsight, I think you can see some reasons why. And then you see the reasons, too, that God is justified in taking away from these people and giving it to others, is because it's ultimately the judgment on their sinfulness. So you've got those two things. You could still maybe debate why not this or that, but in hindsight, you're able to kind of deduce some of God's planning there, and explain some of it very solidly while still knowing, like, this was God's plan. And some of it is certainly beyond our understanding. Yeah, and that's always one of the big arguments that people have, or one of the big issues people have with the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. And there are even quite a few people who are Christians, and I think we would admit they truly are Christians, that have an improper view of God in the Old Testament, that he's a judgmental God. In fact, I was just watching a movie on the plane that I'd seen before where it's like old-timey Hollywood, and they're making one of these pictures like the Ten Commandments, like movies that used to be made. And they bring in this council of religious figures to be like, can we make this movie and not offend anybody? And so they bring in a Jewish rabbi, and they bring in a Protestant pastor, and they bring in another kind of Protestant pastor and a Catholic priest, and they ask, are people going to get offended by this? And it's one of those things where I forget which one of the characters it is. It's either the Catholic guy or one of the Protestant ones who says the God of the Old Testament is this just judge or whatever, and the God of the New Testament is about love. And you're like, no, it's the same God in both places. And then you get the Jew saying, well, Jesus is not really God, so it doesn't matter how you portray him, right? And you're like, this is how the world thinks of these things, and even how Christianity is portrayed, because so many real Christians do have this lack of understanding. But there's that big verse in, I don't know if it's Abraham's life or Isaac, but God says, or the sin of, and I forget which ones it is particularly, has not yet reached its full measure. Well, that's a couple generations even before Joseph. And then you get to Exodus, and generations have passed, and then another generation passes here, before Moses goes back. And so all that time, and then the Israelites are going to be wandering in the wilderness, and another generation is going to pass. And during all that time, those people are living in Canaan. And so it's not as if they don't have that time of grace. But God knows what's going to happen, doesn't he? And then you get into that difficult wrestling match in your mind of God's foreknowledge does not mean God's determination. Like, just because he knows what will happen does not mean that's what he sets forward has to happen. People truly have a free will in those things, but they don't have the free will to decide to follow God, because how can they know God if they're spiritually dead and they're spiritually blind, right? And it becomes a very big nebulous thing that you kind of got to boil it down to be like, okay, what do I know? Solid facts, right? God reveals himself through his word. God makes it clear that man is sinful, and that separates him from God. But God is gracious. And how does he call us to his grace? He calls us through his word. In these later times, he has spoken through his son. Right? Simple truths, and then you build out and try to make sense of all this great, big, nebulous thing. But going back to your point, how can God be, quite frankly, very, very vengeful and harsh, you know? You talk about some of the imprecatory psalms of even just the graphic description of what's going to happen to these people, and it's extremely harsh. But they've given that time, and God's gracious in allowing them not to just be destroyed immediately even, right? Like, I wiped them out, Israel, it's vacant. Go on and move in. He would have had every right to do that, and yet he extended that time. So it's a big concept to wrap your mind around, for sure, and I don't think someone who struggles with it is going to hear a discussion like this once and be like, okay, maybe they would, but it probably is going to take time, you know. It maybe even be something that you struggle with all the time, because there are always those things that, you know, because of our sinful nature, we're going to wrestle with of, doesn't make sense, or I don't like that, but we humbly submit ourselves to God's word, right, and say he's going to help me to understand that, for lack of a better way of saying it. So, yeah, good. Anything else in this section? I guess I do have one more question about what we've read so far, if you want to flip to the back side. We kind of talked about 8, the excuses, but number 7, why did God give signs to Moses to perform? I think we could say in part, right, he was asking these questions, he was kind of going on this path of excuses, but what other reason would there be for God to give Moses these signs? Yeah, visual confirmation. And maybe in some ways, too, we could compare it to, well, the Christ comes performing miracles, just as he was foretold to come and do, and it's not that people believed in God because of the miracles, but the miracles gave validity to these things, didn't it? These are things that come from God. So we ought to take notice, and we ought to listen. And we see that, you know, God tells Moses, the elders of Israel are going to listen. And they do. And they see it, and they say, this is from God. And again, they knew who their God was, though not as much as they would come to learn in the coming days and years. But it worked as God said it would. All right, let's read just the end of chapter 4 then. We've got one more little thing to talk about, and then we'll call it good for today. So let's pick it up at verse 18. Then Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Let me go back to my own people in Egypt to see if any of them are still alive." Jethro said, "Go, and I wish you well." Now the Lord had said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all the men who wanted to kill you are dead." So Moses took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, and started back to Egypt. And he took the staff of God in his hand. The Lord said to Moses, "When you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I have given you the power to do. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then say to Pharaoh, 'This is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son. And I told you, let my son go, so he may worship me. But you refused to let him go. So I will kill your firstborn son.' At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskin, and touched Moses' feet with it. 'Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me,' she said. So the Lord let him alone. At that time she said, 'bridegroom of blood,' referring to circumcision. Then the Lord said to Aaron, 'Go into the desert to meet Moses.' So he met Moses at the mountain of God, and he kissed him. Then Moses told Aaron everything the Lord had sent him to say, and also about the miraculous signs he had commanded him to perform. Moses and Aaron brought together all the elders of the Israelites, and Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses. He also performed the signs before the people, and they believed. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshipped." So at this point, we kind of return to that very condensed type of account. Moses is going to tell his intentions to his father-in-law. Moses is going to go back. God gives some final remarks about what this interaction is going to be like, even talking about the end things, right? The firstborn, that's going to be the conclusion of all of this. It starts out kind of simple with God wants his people to go worship. Well, Pharaoh's not going to let that happen. In fact, he's going to be really, really strict not to let anything happen. Here's going to be the conclusion of that. You get this little strange situation that's kind of hard to decipher in the middle. That's what we'll talk about in a moment. And then at the end, Moses meets with Aaron, right? Relates all these things. They go to the elders, relate all these things, and the people believe as they were supposed to. And I think the big thing is, right, they hear that God was concerned about them. They're given some relief in their suffering there. To hear direct revelation from God spoken from Moses and Aaron. So wrapping up these first parts before then we get to God's interactions here between Pharaoh leading up to the Exodus. But let's talk a little bit about this difficult situation. And the reason why it is difficult is because it is so condensed. It's not a long story. We're not given a lot of details, and we're working with translations and ancient languages, and so it's kind of hard when we're not given a whole lot of information to piece together exactly what happened here. But what are your initial thoughts? How should we understand this curious situation that occurs as Moses is traveling back to Egypt with his family? Maybe if we want to just narrow our focus a little bit, what does it seem is at the heart of the issue here? That God was going to kill Moses. What does it seem to circle around? It would seem so, right? And particularly circumcision, because that's what brings a resolution about. And so, again, it's condensed. There's not a lot of detail. Was it that? Well, obviously Moses hadn't circumcised his son. Yeah, I think that would be appropriate. Yeah, that's the son that we're told about. So he hasn't circumcised him as he should. We know that God's very serious about covenant matters and God's serious about everything that he says, right? And so here's Moses going to go lead these people, and yet he hadn't done this thing. And all we're told is God is very serious about these things, and then he relents here, right? And there's even that fruit of repentance. And it's kind of interesting, Zipporah, that phrase, you are now a bridegroom of blood. There's a connection there in the blood, Moses to her, Moses with the son, all of them with God. It's not very clear. And it's certainly not something we want to get tripped up on, but it's kind of interesting how it's placed here. Right? Calls Moses, go do this, and yet there's some deficiency in how Moses is reacting to God's promises, and God's going to state the seriousness of it. And then as he goes forward, right, there's this blood bond between God and this family and themselves. And it remains a difficult piece just because God was about to kill him. Well, how, when, even the why exactly, we're not sure. Zipporah does the circumcision and then, kind of goes that extra step, touching it to his feet. It's difficult. It is. But it doesn't take anything away from the story because it's not inconsistent with how God operates. It's not inconsistent with anything else in the story. It's just lacking some detail and maybe not what we're used to hearing, certainly not in this series of events. But it shows us God's seriousness on this thing. And ultimately, Moses gets back to Egypt. Any last questions before we wrap things up this morning? Yeah, and it's interesting too. You see it with this family of Reuel, Jethro is his other title, and then with the wife that clearly they were God-fearing. And even that first name means friend of God. I forget what Jethro means, but and then Zipporah doing this action, and then later on when Jethro is, advises Moses and says, "Hey, you should not do all this work yourself. You should have judges to help you out here." That there was probably some knowledge of the true God, and then through Moses, at the very least, the same kind of knowledge that he had, and God-fearing people being significant in the story, and quick thinking, certainly. And it makes you wonder, if she thought, hey, we need to do this and let's do it quickly, why it hadn't taken place already, especially if we are going to go down that route of thinking not circumcising his son was the root of this. Was it laziness? Was it trying to be, a little syncretistic where you go along with other people's custom, but also fear God? Was it, who knows, exactly. All right. Well, we'll stop there. Next time we'll probably kind of fast forward into now the plagues. And we might try to go quickly through that too. It kind of depends on.